Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum, or JPPM, was established in 1983 as a state museum of archaeology and history. JPPM includes 560 acres of farmland and woodlands along both the Patuxent River and St. Leonard's Creek in Calvert County. More than 70 archaeological sites, dating from 7000 BC to the 1940s, have been located on the property. One of the missions of the museum is to locate, document, preserve, and interpret these archaeological sites. JPPM is also the home of the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory, known as the MAC Lab, which houses over 8 million artifacts. The MAC Lab serves as a repository for archaeological collections recovered from land-based and underwater projects conducted by state and federal agencies throughout Maryland. These collections are available for research, education, and exhibit purposes to students, scholars, museum curators, and educators. Archaeological evidence indicates that Indians were present on the JPPM property at least 9,000 years ago. Earlier sites are now underwater, flooded by the widening Patuxent. These first Indians were semi-nomadic, traveling seasonally to various locations in search of food, stone for tools, and other resources. Long-distance trade networks developed early on, bringing stone from western Maryland, Ohio, and New York to this area. As populations increased, Indian groups began to exploit a wider variety of environments, which meant new tools had to be developed. Stone axes, adzes, spear throwers, and various grinding stones appeared. The developing tidal and freshwater marshes provided additional plant and animal resources, particularly oysters. Southern Maryland is dotted with huge shell middens that indicate how extensively oysters were used by the native people. By 3,000 years ago, the first pottery was being made in this area, while bows and arrows were introduced around 1,000 years ago. An economy based on agriculture, particularly corn, beans, and squash, developed at this time. Villages became larger and more stationary, though seasonal hunting and nut-gathering groups continued to travel during the fall and winter. By 600 years ago, some villages were even fortified. Here along the Patuxent River, European explorers in the early 1600s observed several villages whose chief's village was also located on Battle Creek. Collectively known as the Patuxent Indians, they maintained their independence and were closely aligned with the Nanticoke. Pressures from European settlers and northern Indians eventually forced the Patuxents from their traditional homes. Some left to join other Indian tribes in southern Maryland and the Eastern Shore. Descendants of these people still live in the region today. Europeans began to settle along the Patuxent River in the late 1630s. The first person to own the property that became JPPM was Governor William Stone, who patented the parcel he called St. Leonard sometime between 1648 and 1652. The famous Act Concerning Religion, which attempted to legislate religious toleration, was passed during Stone's tenure as colonial governor. In 1652, St. Leonard was acquired by Stone's son, Thomas. While it is not clear if the Stones resided on the property, there must have been buildings here, since during the 1650s, the Maryland General Assembly, Lord Baltimore's Council of Maryland, and the Provincial Court all met at St. Leonard on occasion. In 1663, Stone sold the plantation to Richard Smith Sr., who had been the first person appointed to the newly created office of Attorney General for Maryland in 1657. St. Leonard stayed in the possession of the Smith family for almost 150 years. It was a large farm during that period, dependent on the labor of many enslaved Africans for economic success. Richard Smith Sr. built a house in the vicinity of where the JPPM administrative offices and the Maryland Archaeological Conservation Laboratory are today. After he died around 1689, his son Richard Jr. inherited the property and built a new house a short distance to the north. JPPM archaeologists excavated the site of the second house in the 1980s. It is known today as King's Reach and is an outdoor interpretive site for visitors. Richard Smith, Jr. was a supporter of Governor Charles Calvert, the 3rd Lord Baltimore. A militia captain, he was one of the few Protestant leaders to remain loyal to the Catholic Calvert during the 1689 revolution that overthrew his government. Being on the wrong side of the rebellion, Smith was arrested and incarcerated. It was only through the efforts of his wife, Barbara, who traveled to England to appeal to the Crown for his release, that Smith regained his freedom. He was later appointed Surveyor General for Maryland. In 1711, he built a new house at the south end of his plantation, on a point overlooking the mouth of St. Leonard Creek. Archaeologists excavating this site named it Smith's St. Leonard. Richard Jr. lived there until he passed away in 1714. Walter Smith inherited the property after his father's death. He was a major in the militia and a longtime member of the General Assembly. He stayed at Smith's St. Leonard until his death in 1748. By 1754, the plantation was in the hands of his 8-year-old grandson, also named Walter Smith, who continued to own it until his death in 1804. However, Walter's father had lived a few miles away on Parker's Creek, and there is no evidence to suggest that young Walter ever moved to St. Leonard. As an absentee landlord, Walter did probably arrange for tenants or slaves to live and work on the property. Walter also produced perhaps the most well-known family member, his daughter, Margaret Makel Smith, who married Zachary Taylor and became the First Lady of the United States. In 1809, St. Leonard passed out of the Smith family ownership. In 1834, Danish sea captain John Peterson purchased the old Smith plantation. For 4 generations, the property stayed in the Petersons' possession. They built a house on a hill overlooking the mouth of St. Leonard's Creek, probably near where the American cannons were situated in the War of 1812. When it burned in 1904, they constructed a new house on the same site. Dr. George Peterson conducted his medical practice at that house, while tenants, particularly the Fowler family, ran the farm. In 1932, Jefferson Patterson purchased the Peterson property to create his Point Farm estate. Among the tenants on the Peterson farm were 3 remarkable women who had once been enslaved there: Sukeek, the only name we have for her daughter Rebecca Coates, and her granddaughter Jane Dawkins Johnson. After the Civil War, some, if not all, of these women lived in houses a short distance from the Peterson home. Some of Jane Dawkins Johnson's descendants, members of the extended Gross family, told JPPM staff about the ruins of this house and the people who lived there. With their assistance, archaeologists excavated the site, known as Sukeek's Cabin. Visitors to JPPM can see the ruins and learn more from the interpretive signs located on the site, and elsewhere on the property, they can discover the central role that African Americans, both enslaved and free, played in the history of this place.
Jefferson Patterson purchased the land that is now JPPM in 1932. He hired architect Gertrude Sawyer to create his vision of the property he called Point Farm. In 1934, he left for Breslau and then Norway, coming home on leave when he could to visit the farm. While in charge of the prisoner of war section at the American Embassy in Berlin from 1939 to 1940, he met Mary Marvin Breckinridge, who was on assignment for CBS. They were married at the embassy on June 16, 1940. One of Mr. Patterson's most notable achievements as a diplomat was his instrumental role in arranging a ceasefire between Israel and Egypt in January 1949 during the Palestine War. After Jefferson Patterson died on November 12, 1977, Mrs. Patterson began to busily decollect her husband's holdings. Knowing her husband's love for Point Farm, she began looking for someone worthy to give it to. At the same time, a tenant found Indian artifacts on the farm. A survey of the property conducted by state archaeologists revealed dozens of prehistoric and historic period sites. The Maryland Historical Trust nominated the property to the National Register of Historic Places. In 1983, Mary Marvin Breckenridge Patterson donated to the public one of the most important archaeological properties in the Chesapeake Bay region. Her gift to the state of Maryland of the Point Farm Estate, the largest land gift the state has ever been given, created Jefferson Patterson Park and Museum. On the southeastern tip of JPPM, you will find Peterson's Point, where St. Leonard Creek flows into the Patuxent River. You will also find Patterson's Beach House, designed, like the other buildings, by noted architect Gertrude Sawyer. The workers mocked her for overbuilding it. The next year there was a hurricane and it was the only structure still standing. When you look up the creek from the cabin, you can see where Richard Smith's harbor would have been. Peterson's Point is also famous for the first execution of a criminal in Calvert County, which occurred here in the 17th century. John Dandy was a blacksmith accused of several murders. In May 1657, Dandy lost control for the final time. His apprentice, Henry Gouge, had been sent to get live coals from a nearby kiln for the forge, and when he was too slow at his task, Dandy pursued him. Neighbors said they heard screams, cries of pain and distress. Dandy returned, saying the boy had run away. His body was found the next day, naked and floating down a creek near a still at Newtown. A search for his clothes, suspecting he'd disrobed to swim, revealed nothing. The corpse was black and blue, with the marks of a savage attack. Strangely, Dandy was with the search party and volunteered to help drag the body ashore. Bystanders claimed that when Dandy touched the corpse, Gouge's mouth and a deep cut in his head started to bleed. In the 17th century, this was admissible evidence at trial, as it was supposed to indicate the victim identifying its slayer. Dandy was hanged right here on Peterson's Point.